Hey there everyone, Steve the Amateur Historian, and I'm coming to you from the vicinity of, this is Southwest 11th and Salmon Streets. And over my shoulder here, this apartment building up here, I believe it's called the Pinecone Apartments, or at least it was called that at one point. This building was built in 1909, so it wouldn't have quite been here yet for this 1907 case that I have for you in a brand new episode of Historic Murders of Portland. So we're in some pretty deep history here. This big building here, I believe it's like affordable housing now, but back in the 80s when the Rajneeshis were trying to take over Oregon, pretty much, they bought this building and it was called the Hotel Rajneesh for a while until, eventually they got kind of run out one by one and it changed and it used to just be a hotel. But then right over here is the Pinecone Apartments. And approximately at the side of this building, I want to say the actual directions kind of put me more towards being just this side of it in this parking lot, is where someplace, it may have been a house, it may have been an apartment, I am not dead certain. But whatever housing structure it was, this is where the Glaze family lived in specifically November 1907. So this general area, it's along Southwest 11th between Salmon and Main Street up there, kind of getting towards the backside of downtown Portland where it's a little bit more quieter, at least these days. But right in this vicinity is where the Glazes lived, and they were Minon Glaze, M-I-N-O-N. I actually had to look that up to find out how it was pronounced. Minon Glaze and his wife Mary Glaze lived here. And according to the information I found, they also had a 6-year-old son. And on November 10th, 1907, Mary Glaze came running from their home, claiming that her husband had just tried to commit suicide and running around frantically trying to get, anyone's attention who would come and possibly help her. But there was one problem with this notion right out of the gate. When Minon's dead body was discovered, it was shown that he had been shot in the back. So how, not just how, but why would someone choose that method if they're going to commit suicide, to shoot themselves in the back? It seemed like we were looking at a murder here. So the Glazes, they had an interesting history to them. They had actually fled here from Russia. They were Russian natives, and apparently Minon had committed a criminal act. This is all according to his wife, who after running out of the place screaming suicide, she went into kind of an emotional fit and fainted, and they had to take her to the hospital. But when she came around, she said that, her and her husband had ultimately relocated to Portland, but it was because they had to flee Russia after her husband had committed a crime that was apparently life-threatening. So they fled Russia into Japan and then took a boat to San Francisco and ultimately ended up here in Portland. And, so Minon had a history of criminal acts, and apparently he'd been really prominent in Russia and wanted some of that prominence back. So he wanted to commit another crime, and he apparently told his wife he wanted to swindle a prominent local businessman on a deal, swindle him out of some money. And Mary refused to have anything to do with it. They'd already had to flee their homeland because of his criminal activity, and she wanted nothing to do with the next scheme that he wanted to pull. And according to people who lived nearby, they had been fighting all day. So authorities kind of got the idea that this was possibly a murder. There was no way it was suicide. The guy had been shot in the back. It was either a murder or possibly a shooting out of self-defense. They were kind of dabbling with that, but again, if you shoot someone in the back, how is that self-defense? Like, what, was he like running backwards into her? Like, how does that work out? So, and that being said, they may very well have lived in these apartments. Again, the address kind of implied it was just to this side of it. Well, no, they wouldn't have, because these apartments weren't here yet, but general site of these apartments. So it seemed like it was a murder case, but Minon was known to be abusive. So they couldn't fully dismiss that possibility. He'd apparently been violent against her, and she'd had to call authorities on him in the past. So he had a past history of being abusive towards his wife. And as we all know, sometimes you can only go so far in terms of being violent against your supposed loved ones before they fight back and take action. So, had Mary had enough? You know, she already didn't like that this guy wanted to engage in another criminal enterprise, but he may have also gotten confrontational and abusive because she wanted to resist this. And that could have led to a scuffle that led to her shooting him. And the reason I pose these questions about what actually happened here by where the pine cone is today is because this is one of those stories where it was on the front, well, maybe not on the front page, but it was in the papers regularly for a couple of days. And then it seems like they just faded away. They became not worthy to print anymore. So the questions were there and they kind of lingered. I couldn't even find an article that's, you know, it seemed pretty clear that Mary had shot Minon, whether it was self-defense or not. But it's so interesting that, you know, just as the story was getting hot and there was questions being left unanswered, we kind of got thrown to the wolves, so to speak. And there's still all these questions because is it totally understandable that this might be self-defense? Absolutely. Minon would have a reason to get hostile with his wife in that she was resisting what he wanted to do. And he was known to be abusive, so why would she not ever feel that she would need to take precautions and defend herself at some point? That's absolutely a possibility. But at the same time, it's still very suspicious to me. How do you shoot someone in the back as an act of self-defense? It can happen. Absolutely, it could happen. He could have said, like, he could have turned away from her and reached for some kind of weapon, and she would realize, oh God, I have to protect myself. And as he's turned from her and grabbing something, she grabs a gun, but still, she would have to get her hands on. I mean, I highly doubt just when they started arguing, she just had a gun in her hand. So as much as he would have to turn to go get a weapon, she would have to go and get a weapon too. It's very hard for me to believe in a self-defense claim when you shoot someone in the back. That's a classic example of kind of planned murder, is when nobody's watching. They got their back turned to you, you pull the gun out and shoot them. So there's reason for me to think that this was, you know, not long-term premeditated, but it is possible that, you know, and I forgot to mention, they got run out of Russia because of Minon's criminal activities. They got run out of San Francisco for the same thing. He tried to pull like a liquor scheme and it blew up, and they had to flee San Francisco and come north to Portland. And it was like, every time they got settled down, he would do something to mess their lives up and uproot them, and they would have to go out and, you know, restart their lives. And here they have a 6-year-old kid, and Minon's acting like, you know, acting like a jackass, you know, career criminal, and putting his family's safety on the line, you know. And then he brings up this scheme, and it's like, great, we're gonna get run out of this city too. It's never going to end. We're gonna grow up on the run. Our child's never gonna have a normal childhood. And I could possibly see Mary, after he brought that up, and her saying, no, absolutely not, we're not going through this again. And him, you know, he could have just been stern and been like, this is happening, you don't tell me what to do. This is 1907, and I'm the man, so we do what I want. And she could have decided, you know, even without thinking about it too long, she could have decided, this is never going to end. So I have to take drastic action, but I also have a child to be concerned about. So what do I do? So she could have decided, you know, for the sake of me, for the sake of my child, for the sake of our futures, she could have decided to kill him, you know? So she's perfectly set. She just has the gun close by. She waits for him to not be looking, and she shoots him right in the back, and she comes out screaming suicide, thinking, well, if I scream suicide, people will believe me, and then they'll think he killed himself, and I'll be off scot-free. And of course, I never was able to find an article that showed whether she was actually arrested. If this guy really was such a crooked criminal, and he really was as abusive as he supposedly was, I could see authorities maybe letting her off the hook, or maybe giving her a slap on the wrist, and in the end, kind of just essentially deciding, you know, this guy was a scumbag. That happened with a case I covered about this guy named G. Marty, who may have been harassing a woman, she may have been harassing him, and some guys came up and beat him to death. And in the end, it was generally believed that Marty had been harassing this woman, so even though, like, it was never found out who these two guys were that beat him up, there wasn't really much urgency on the part of the public to find out, because they figured this was a guy just walking around harassing women, so who cares? He was a scab. They may have kind of decided that about Minon Glaze and let his wife off. And they may have decided that it was a suicide for whatever reason, and she may have gone off scot-free, but I never found any verification that she was arrested, tried, brought to trial, convicted, found innocent. None of that stuff. And so that, unfortunately, is kind of where we sit with this case, as far as I can tell. Now, there are some cases where there's been a whole lot of information out there, and when I did the video, I finished, and I was like, you know, alas, I don't know all the details, and sometimes I won't know if the perpetrator got caught, who actually went to prison, did they go to prison, was so-and-so charged, all these questions. And sometimes I actually find answers to them, but in this case, for now, I couldn't really find anything after more than like 3 or 4 days after this murder happened. It's truly bizarre that there was just nothing, and I couldn't find anything later in relation to Mary Glaze, whether she went on trial or anything. There would have had to have at least been like one article out there if she'd actually gone on trial for her husband's murder, which makes me wonder if she was in charge, or if maybe they determined there wasn't enough there, or they decided that her husband was a big enough scumbag that, you know, well, you got a kid to take care of, we'll, you know, believe you when you say it was self-defense or whatever. Obviously, she called it a suicide initially, which was proven to just could not have been true. But even then, she could have been just trying to cover her back for something she felt she needed to do. But for now, I don't know what happened in this case beyond the circumstances really of the crime itself, which is fine in the overall scheme of things, because that is the focus, is the telling of the murder story, and in particular the events kind of leading up to it, what brought this particular case about. And we still have both of those elements in this particular case, so maybe I'll find some revelation on it. I know that, like, there was one article that said they also went by the last name of Berg, like, as another name they went under. So I looked under Minenberg, Mary Berg, you know, Berg. I tried to look up under that too and found nothing. So that was just another dead end. So I don't know. That's all I got as far as the 1907 murder of Minon Glaze. Possibly a murder. So, as always, I'd like to thank you guys so much for stopping by, taking this video, supporting this series, supporting this channel, supporting me. And if you haven't gotten around to it, you're new to the channel, whatever the circumstances. Remember, I want to help a small channel like me out. Remember to like the video, share, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done that yet. Hit up my Patreon. I'm trying to post there at least twice a week, and various forms of different content, from podcast type stuff, extra video that others, regular YouTube viewers can't watch. A lot of extra types of content you can only see if you join my Patreon today. The link to that is in the description with this video, as well as the links to my Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Reddit subreddit pages. And all that said, till next time, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian with another episode of Historic Murders of Portland.